Welcome to the Be the Change podcast with your host, Ralph Harper. On this podcast, he shares his vision for the future of the United States. Think of this podcast as somewhat of a roadmap to times in the future on a continuum from a dark past to the 2060s. Yep, that's right. He's a forward thinker whose purpose is to dictate positive outcomes for our children and our country versus leaving it all to chance. Ralph will cover parenting, fatherhood, accountability, and what it takes to win in this great nation. It's not just Ralph. He will have difficult conversations with other thought leaders of different backgrounds and political affiliations. It's time to get started. Here's your host, Ralph Harper.
Hello everybody, my name is Ralph Harper. Yes, that's my name. I know you don't meet very many brothers named Ralph or Harper, but that's my name. Welcome to this podcast. I'm very excited about what we plan to do this year in 2019. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year to you. I hope that most of you are planning to achieve your prosperity in 2019. I wish you all the best. I'd like to start this by telling you a short story. My brother, his name is Stephen Harper. He's in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where I'm from. Over 10 years ago, I think, I got a phone call, and my family members, one of my brothers told me about the fact that Steve was in the hospital and they believed that he had throat cancer. Now, my brother had smoked for over 30 years or so. And so for me, that seemed maybe logical that he might have developed throat cancer from smoking for so many years. And he had a successful surgery, and it was treated with chemo and radiation and everything those doctors at the University of Alabama in Birmingham could do. Those doctors were amazing. They more than likely saved my brother's life. And he's still with us today. He has a trach in his throat, and sometimes, all the time, whenever he talks, he has to cover that trach up in order to talk. But he's alive and he's well. I tell that story because maybe 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, I was having issues coughing a lot. And I went to visit a doctor, and I was just assuming this was allergies or something like that. But as it turned out, I had polyps on my larynx. I had to have surgery as well. And the first time I had the surgery, it was precancerous. Maybe not even 6 weeks later, I was tested again by my doctor, who is absolutely amazing, Dr. Arvizo in the Dallas, Texas area. And either the polyps had come back or she found additional ones. To make a long story short, I had to have a second surgery. I tell that story because I didn't expect to have cancer, especially in my throat, because I never smoked. It turns out the cells that Dr. Arvizo found in my throat or on my larynx were precancerous, and there's a good chance, had I not had her do something about it, there's a good chance I might have had cancer develop in my body as well. But she's given me the green light to move on, and I've seen her with my follow-up this year, and she gave me another year, and I don't have to see her. She didn't find any new cells. But I'm saying this in my first podcast because those surgeries have impacted my voice, and this is it. This is my new voice now, and I've tried to take voice lessons and so on, and my voice is always raspy. In part, I think, because of the surgeries, but also because of the fact that I do have issues with allergies. But I want to move on now because I want to today cover a topic related to race relations in the United States. This has been a topic that I've been covering for several months now, and probably a couple of years because of my nonprofit organization and some of the things I'm trying to do with that. But also just because of my concern about race relations and a belief that I have that, first, it has never ever been addressed by any president of the United States of America, or it hasn't been taken seriously. But on the other hand, I think that if there is focus on it, that we could get better and our country could be better as a result of addressing the racial problems that exist in the United States of America. The topic of this podcast is, why are you sounding white? It seems to be a silly question, but it's a serious one, and it just happens to be a pet peeve of mine. This question has to do with race relations. To talk about race in a bigger picture context, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about race in terms of the possibility that what we experience today has derived from over 150 years ago, since slavery ended. I'm that guy who gives Abraham Lincoln a lot of points, a lot of credit for ending slavery. However, a lot of my friends, and I think a lot of other people, including a lot of African American people in the country, might argue that I'm not right, that my view on this is wrong. But I feel strongly about my view, and I think that because Abraham Lincoln was the one who initiated the initial document that would ultimately turn out to be the Emancipation Proclamation, that he played a big role in that, and by default, he was responsible for the end of slavery. In addition, when I consider the fact that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and assassinated more than likely because of his decision to end slavery, I think it's irresponsible to ignore that and to suggest that his actions did not play a pretty significant role ending slavery in the United States of America. That is just my view on that. Let's talk about slavery for a minute, because this is a big deal, and a lot of people don't understand the ills of slavery and how serious of an event, of an era this was. Think about this though. 4.2 million African people died in their respective countries in Africa fighting against slavery. Let me repeat that. 4.2 million African people died in their respective countries fighting against slavery. In addition, 2.2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage on the Atlantic Ocean. Let's put this into context as well. These passages across the Atlantic Ocean from the continent of Africa took on average 6 full months to get from Africa to the shores of the United States of America. There were several of these trips back and forth to pick up slaves and bring them back and head back. 2.2 Africans died on the Atlantic Ocean, and their souls rest at the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. 12.5 million African people served as slaves in the United States of America. Those are big numbers. To further put that into context, these 12.5 million African people who served as slaves in the United States of America, many of them, more than likely most of them, they were born slaves, and they died the same way. It's all they knew. And then there was the Civil War. The Civil War, in my opinion, which was spearheaded by Abraham Lincoln, which ultimately ended slavery. Think about this. This is another very serious number. Over 620,000 soldiers, Confederate soldiers conflated with Union soldiers, 620,000 of them died fighting for and against slavery. Those numbers are real, and the bottom line is that many people fighting to death for and against slavery in the United States. But the question becomes, when you think about slavery, when you think about that egregious era, those egregious things that happened during slavery, you have to ask yourself the question, is it possible certain people in our country are still impacted by slavery and and the events of slavery. I was talking to a friend maybe 2 years ago after I started writing my book, and I called her to ask her, I said, hey, listen, I need some documents, something to justify my belief that African American people are possibly still impacted by slavery. She suggested I read this book. It's titled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. I read her book, and as I was reading her book, I started to realize that just based on my particular experiences growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, and some of the other experiences that I had had over the course of my life, and I thought about how my life may have been impacted by slavery. I could not put that book down over the entire weekend. I completed it at a park bench in Plano, Texas. I completed that book because I could feel a sense that my life had been and was possibly still being impacted by slavery because of my thoughts and my views about race relations in the United States, because of the way that I had been treated over the course of my life. And but I realized that in that thought process of reading this book, that it wasn't just my life that had been impacted by slavery, but I believe that white people and their lives have been impacted by slavery as well. No, I'm not suggesting every single white person's life has been impacted by slavery, but I believe that a fraction of white people's lives have been impacted by slavery. No, I'm not suggesting that every single black person in the United States' life has been impacted by slavery, but I believe that a fraction of black people's lives have been impacted by slavery. I believe that. And I believe it based on what I see and what I feel happening in terms of race relations today. I just have a fundamental belief that anyone in the United States of America in this day and time who firmly believes that they are better than someone else for no other particular reason than the color of their skin, I believe that that person has been impacted by something. And I just believe that given our history, it must be that they have been impacted by slavery and how it ended. But I also believe that in the African American community, any black person who is so caught up with anger and so angry about white people that they can't stand to be near them, they don't want to look like them, they don't want to talk like them, they don't want to conform to any of the norms of things that happen in the United States of America, even if it means that these are the kinds of norms and values that could cause you to enhance your life 10 times over. They'd rather not do it because of their anger and their disdain for white people. I want to take you on a journey of events that have happened since the end of slavery. And I want to show you how very, very simple research has taught me that every 50 years since slavery ended, including the end of slavery, there has been a very significant event that happened that brought slaves closer to being equal. So again, there has been an event that happened ever since slavery ended, including the end of slavery, that has brought black American people closer to achieving the equality that they have so desperately been fighting for as many years. But just as there has been an event that happened, there has also been a major response, a major negative response from average factions of white United States citizens to these responses have been to the positive event that happened in terms of African American people achieving a certain level of success on their quest to being equal and treated equally to whites in the United States. The first event was actually the end of slavery. In the years after slavery ended, the response was that white Americans in the South totally neglected all freed slaves. These freed slaves didn't have anywhere to go. They had no means for buying food. They had no work, and they were completely neglected. Neglected to a point where over 1 million slaves died of starvation and disease. That was the United States response to slaves being freed in the United States of America. Imagine that. 1 million freed slaves died of starvation. They also died of disease as they were neglected by factions of white people in the South as they responded to slaves being freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Imagine the heart of that person who stood to watch a freed slave take his or her last breath, dying of starvation. Now, fast forward exactly 50 years almost. Now, fast forward almost exactly 50 years from the 1860s to the 1910s. There was a small town called Greenwood, Oklahoma. It was founded by blacks. Some of them freed slaves. They were prosperous. They were doing their thing, being very successful. They were doctors, they were lawyers, they were teachers. They had their own schools, their own businesses, their own buildings, their stores. The dollar in their city circulated over 19 times before it left the city of Greenwood to the outside communities. The primary reason those African American people landed in Greenwood, Oklahoma, was because of segregation and the fact that they weren't allowed really to do business with white people in the area. So they were kind of forced to do business among themselves, and they were very successful at it. Over the span of a couple of decades, Greenwood, Oklahoma became world-renowned as the Black Wall Street. They were thriving until one day, a young white woman accused a black young man of flirting with her in an elevator. Within a few days, the local whites responded to that success by completely burning the entire town down. They didn't just burn the town down, they bombed and burned the town down and arrested hundreds of African American people in that city. And that city never recovered from that. And it was known as the race riots of the 1920s, 1921. But again, think about that. There was another successful story. Black American people succeeding and thriving in their city and doing their thing. And then all of a sudden they were bombed and burned and arrested, and that was the end of that. And I have to be honest with you, because it breaks my heart to know that there has never, ever been anything like that since. And it's unfortunate, but that is the reality that we're dealing with here. So then if you fast forward again, almost exactly 50 years from the 1910s, then you land in the 1960s, the decade most of us are very familiar with because most of us are still around. Some of our young children may not remember these events, but people died. They died for the rights and the equality of Black American people in the United States of America. Several people died. And in that process, though, we achieved voting rights and civil rights and education and all these things. But think about the people who died in that process. They included Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, 4 little girls who were bombed in a church in 1963, and a church in my hometown, Birmingham, Alabama. It's called the 16th Street Baptist Church. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair. 4 beautiful young lives bombed in the basement of a church by Klansmen, all because of race relations and a notion that Black American people should never rise to the level of being equal to white Americans in the United States of America. Martin Luther King was also assassinated in the 1960s. There were a host of other people who lost their lives fighting for freedom, fighting for equality of Black American people in the South. And it all happened 50 years later. Once again, there's something about 50 years that is, to me, intriguing. Because when I think about that, and then I think about just moving forward, again, 50 years from the 1960s, and where do we land? We land in the 2010s. And guess what happened then? A young Black American man with a funny name, Barack Obama, became president of the United States of America. The first Black American president of the United States of America, Barack Obama. That whole experience for me was so profound. And I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the inauguration and all that I experienced that day when I made a conscious choice to take the day off and just watch that ceremony, because that to me was just one of the most amazing things that I have ever experienced in my entire life. But believe me, there has been a response, yet still, against the fact that President Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States of America, became president. That response has been a lot of what we are experiencing today. But to put this in perspective, think about this, right? When Barack Obama became president of the United States, while George W. Bush was still president, there were 149 militia groups in the United States. After President Obama's election, that number grew from 149 to 512 militia groups. And that represented a 340% increase in the number of militia groups in the United States. During President Obama's second term as president in 2013, the number of militia groups grew to 1,360. And that represented an increase of over 912%. I'm sure everybody remembers the spike in police brutality. Trayvon Martin and all these other young men, young Black American men who lost their lives at the hands of police officers who seemed to feel comfortable that there would be no punishment for them, killing young Black American people, young Black American men and boys. And I believe today, the polarization that we're seeing now in the 2010s is a derivative of the fact that we've experienced having a Black American president of the United States of America. I think when our country delivered President Trump to the White House, I think also that was a direct response to the fact that there was a Black American president of the United States of America. Several weeks ago, I was in a Walmart store in my neighborhood, and I encountered a Black American woman with her child. I'm assuming it was her child. And I saw the child tug on his mother's arm for a short while, and he asked his mother if he could have a candy bar. You know how they strategically place candy bars right at the kid's eye level so that they can do just that, ask for a candy bar. But I was shocked by his mother's response. His mother responded by saying, "Yes, you can have a candy bar, but why are you sounding white?" I was dumbfounded. I was shocked because I had just witnessed this woman deny her child the fundamental right to hone the one skill that is absolutely necessary for any child or any person in the United States of America to be successful. I witnessed this woman deny her child the right to speak English. These are the kinds of things that we have to stop in our community, because if we don't, we will forever miss it. There's something about being best in class that trumps racism and discrimination. One of those things is just honing that one skill that is required of people who come to this country to be successful in this country, and that is speaking English. I really don't think our children should be sounding white. I think our children should be speaking the Queen's English and sounding British. That's how well our kids should be speaking English. Because at the end of the day, all white people don't speak English that well. Neither do I. But our kids, they have an opportunity. If we comport ourselves as adults the right way and guide our children the right way, then I can assure you, we will be playing a very different ball game by the time the next 50 years have elapsed and we end up in the 2060s. I fundamentally believe that any parent in the United States of America who is willing to deny their child or their children the right to speak English, I consider that child abuse. This is too important. There are certain things that we need to be doing with our children to ensure their success, and we need to be doing it. We need to be doing it early, and we need to be doing it often. And anything less than providing them positive and meaningful guidance is counterproductive and counter to anything that might be required to succeed in the United States of America. I just believe that being successful in the United States is not that complicated. I think it has to do with two things. The first thing is, the way you comport yourself. And that just is a simple notion about what are you willing to do. The second thing is, well, where are you willing to do it? And I believe that because there are certain geographies in the United States of America where it might be far more difficult for you to succeed than it would be in other geographies. So again, there's two things. What are you willing to do? Where are you willing to do it? When I think of the question of, what are you willing to do? This is just fundamental. If you're willing to be aggressive, and it's been proven, when you look around you, the people who are really focused and headstrong about being successful in our country, they invest the time, they invest the energy, they invest in their education, they invest in all those things that they know will contribute to their success. And that's what every single citizen of the United States of America needs to do. I'm not saying that, hey, listen, this rule applies to every single person, but I can tell you that if you focus on that, on those two things, your chance of being successful in the United States will be enhanced. In terms of what you're willing to do, I have come up with what I believe is the right thing. I call it my WIN model, and it has to do with three very high-level categories. The first is workforce development. The second one has to do with integrity, and the third one has to do with the notion of people supporting the next generation of children in our country, including children, teenagers supporting other children in our country. And within those buckets, that WIN bucket, workforce development has three life principles that I've come up with. They are reading on a regular basis, making your education your absolute number one priority, and working and appreciating the value of working very early in your life. Under the integrity bucket, it has to do with just being accountable for the choices you make, but also respecting yourself and respecting other people within your realm. And the final bucket, the notion of supporting the next generation, has to do with just being dutiful, doing something for other people, supporting nonprofit organizations, starting nonprofit organizations. But I also believe that in order to do that, you have to have some money. And I think people need to be a lot more focused on building wealth and saving money and being financially astute. And that's my model, and that's something that I've come up with, and I have written a lot about that in my book. In fact, most of my book is about those 7 rewards life principles: reading, education, work, accountability, respect, duty, and doing for other people, and saving money. So I will be talking about that a lot more as we go forward. But these life principles have not been developed, and they have not been presented to the world just for, a few people. I think any child in our country who's willing to take that level of charge, or to take that level of accountability for themselves, will be very successful. And I suggest also that if you think about this and think about the idea of, let's say, a million people honing these skills and taking them forward to the 2060s, can you imagine how our kids will be impacted? Moreover, can you imagine how our children's children will be impacted? Think about that. Think about how not just our children who will be impacted, but our children's children, and possibly our children's children, will be impacted. It's a powerful thing, but it's something we just have to focus on. Then the last piece of it is just the idea of trying to figure out the right geography. If you want to stay in Ferguson, Missouri, where the police officers are calling you an MF every day, and you know it's been going on for years, the answer to that problem is figure it out and move. If you want to live in a city that is totally depressed and there aren't any jobs there, then you have to figure it out, but then move. It's as simple as that. There aren't any 7 life principles for that. That just says, hey, listen, you know what? This is not the right geography for me, and I need to move. And that's you have to make a very conscious choice to do that. And a lot of people struggle to make that decision. I moved, and I'm not being negative about the city I moved from. I was from Birmingham, Alabama. I just had an opportunity to move to New York, and I seized that moment. I moved to New York, and I stayed there for almost 15 years, and it worked out. There was more opportunity there. I struggled, but I was willing to take that chance. And people need to be willing to take chances and do what you believe is right for the sake of strapping in and doing what it takes to make it and be very successful, so that you can help to make other people successful in this country. And that's what this is about. That's what this podcast is going to be about for a whole year. And I think you guys may listen to me and you say, hey, listen, he talked about a lot of stuff today, but at the end of the day, there's tons of other stuff, because I want to go deeper in terms of reading, for instance. I want to go deeper and tell some of my personal stories about some of my failures as a way to help other people mitigate those same pitfalls I made. I'm going to talk about education more. I'm going to talk about work, because work doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a 4-year degree. I'm a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and his book Outliers talks about this notion that if you invest 10,000 hours doing something, then there's a good chance you're going to become best in class in that thing, whatever it is that you're doing. And when you become best in class at anything, as long as you're willing to take that information and leverage it the right way, you can be successful, earning money, being successful, being prosperous, and supporting other people. So think about that. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. I appreciate you. I will be back here next week at the same time, and every Tuesday for the rest of the year and beyond. So thank you again for being part of Be the Change.
Thank you for joining us on Be the Change. Be sure to subscribe today and don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best conversations. Visit ralphharper.com for show notes, resources, and events. To support Be the Change, please join our patron community at patreon.com/Ralph Harper. Be the Change returns the same time next week and is brought to you by the 2060s Project.